Hello and welcome back everybody. Today we're going to do Path of Exile 2 and try to find the real minimum requirement, which probably won't be too far off from what the dev already spec for the minimum requirement, which is the i7 7700 or Ryzen 5 2500X, 8GB of RAM, GTX 960 4GB, Intel Arc A380 or AMD Radeon RX 470 4GB variant. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. I'm going to start off with the Intel Arc GPU because there's only one card under the A380, which is the A310. On my video on Intel Arc GPU in Path of Exile 2, the A310 was barely able to hit the 30 FPS at the XeSS native, but if you're willing to enable XeSS at the quality or balance, you'll get over your 30 FPS. You're actually going to reach 35 FPS average. So now you know that the Intel Arc A310 can actually play the game quite decently on top of that. But it was at 1080p, low settings, low texture, XeSS balance. So for Intel side, the A310 is actually the real minimum requirement. So I'm going to start to find out which CPU is the minimum requirement, and to start off I'm going to start with my lowest will be the i7 920. I've paired it with the GTX 960 4GB, which we already know can handle the game, and 8GB of memory. Playing at 1080p, the default setting, which is a bit of medium and high, NIS default, and no upscaling, and dynamic resolution off. That gives us an average FPS of 20. This is not playable, and as you can see, the CPU is pegged at 1%. Try to loading all the assets, so you have a gray square on the ground until it's loaded, and even if you let the CPU load everything, it takes about 10 minutes before you are completely loaded and there's some load relief from the CPU, and even there, the CPU still stay in the 90s. First gen i7, a no-go. Next up will have been the i7 2700, but I don't have one, so I jumped to the third gen, the i7 3770. Still with the GTX 960, with the same configuration, resolution and settings as before. Loading the encampment for the first time, it took way faster than the i7 920, but still took almost 4 minutes to load. And when finished loading, the CPU is still a bottleneck. We are averaging 66 to 77 in CPU utilization, which is too much, dropping our FPS to 23 average. Hopping another generation, the i7 4771. Yes, a word number. I don't have the 4770K, which was super popular. Anyway, the 4771, we're getting closer. Still took quite a while for the CPU to load all the shader or whatever it's loading in the background the first time you load the game and load the map. The CPU is again still a bottleneck. We're getting an average of 28 FPS, but the CPU is always in the 90s. It takes quite a while to load the new map, and every time the map reset or instance reset, the CPU is pegged at 100% for a minute or so just to stabilize everything and load everything. So you get sometimes some gray square on the ground. Not as bad as the i7 3770 or the i7 920, but still not completely loaded when you're able to walk around. But we're getting closer to a playable CPU. And jumping again another generation, the i7 5920K, which is not well known. Most people probably know the i7 5930K. This one I think is come from a workstation. Anyway, if you have the lowest i7 of that generation and it can do the job, then all the one over it will do the job also. And it does the job. When the CPU finish loading all the shader in the background, the CPU fall down to the i20 percentage of utilization, meaning all the burden fall down on the GPU now. That's what we're looking, and we get exactly the same FPS from the i7 7700K. We are at 36 FPS average, and that's at 1080p with the default setting, meaning texture at medium and all the rest at high, upscaling NIS by default, dynamic resolution turn off, which is not by default, and no upscaling. I mean, resolution is not upscaled. So on open world, you're going to have a 46 FPS, and in city, you drop sometimes in the 28-9 FPS, giving us the average of 36. That also includes boss fight or heavy minion on screen, as those to drop the FPS as low as the city. So now we found our CPU. Let's find out on that platform the lowest NVIDIA GPU we can go. Then we'll jump to AMD. I'm going to stay with the i7 5920K for a while testing NVIDIA GPU, but first, before going down, I want to try the GTX 1050 Ti. It's also a 4GB card, which gives similar performance as the GTX 960 4GB variant, but it's a little bit younger. With keeping all the default setting, 1080p, NIS, and dynamic resolution off, we get an average of 40 FPS, a little uplift of 4 FPS comparing to the GTX 960. Keep in mind that you still can play with with all the settings. Right now the texture is at high, the medium, and all the rest is at high. You can drop almost everything to low and be able to reach over 30 FPS with even lower hardware. I mean GPU. CPU, I don't think even lowering will help a lot. It will actually hinder the CPU even more. Anyway, I digress. The 1050 Ti is a pass. Let's start to go back in lower GPU, but still at 3GB card because apparently it's a requirement. We jump in 2013, the GTX 780, the non-Ti, with all the same settings at 1080p. We get a beautiful 33 FPS average. This is playable, and you can even drop some settings if you want even higher FPS, but the 2013 card can still play the game easily. That's a surprise. That means also the GTX 780 Ti can also play the game easily. And since this GPU is more of a DX11 than DX12, it support DX12, but not all the feature of DX12, and the game support DX11, I switched to DX11 instead of 12 to see how the GPU fare. And I don't know if it's supposed to, but it fare way better. We know with the same settings, we get an average of 43 FPS. But I found that when you are in the encampment or small village, your FPS will drop a little bit worse than DX12. We go down up to 25 FPS in the just clear fell encampment. And again, I'm at 1080p, no upscaling, and the default texture at medium and the rest at high. So you can drop all the other settings to have a higher FPS if you drop below 30. Keep in mind though, I find out that in DX11 the frame time is a bit unstable. We have a higher spike and higher down than DX12. I saw FPS go as high as 56 and also as low as 14. I'm not done. I also have a GTX 670 4GB variant. Still everything the same, i7 5920K 8GB, 1080p. Now I changed the settings to the lowest possible, NIS native, dynamic resolution off, and no choice to choose DirectX 11. We get a surprisingly average 33 FPS. Keep in mind, when you're in the city or the encampment, we drop in the 25, and in heavy fight or boss fights, we also drop in the 25 FPS. When fighting a small bunch of minions, you can go up to 43. And also you need to think that I'm not even using upscaling or dynamic resolution. And that's the lowest Nvidia card that I have that has a 3GB or over. So I guess this is our winner, old GTX 670. Now we're done with the Intel and Nvidia. Let's jump to the AMD side, starting with the Ryzen 3 1200 and the R9 380 4GB variant. And I got a better result than I was expected. I know the R9 380 4GB will play the game okay, but the Ryzen 3 1200, I'm sure it was going to be a hell of a bottleneck, but it's not that bad. Yes, it's still a bottleneck, but it's somehow manageable. We're playing at 1080p, the lowest settings, not the default, FSR at quality, not native, dynamic resolution is off, and we get an average of 33 FPS, and it's quite stable at it. In city we are at 30 FPS, and out of city we are around 40 FPS, but the CPU often reach 90% of utilization to 100, dropping the percentage of utilization of the GPU at the same time. That means we have a CPU bottleneck. It's holding off the GPU. Now just upping the CPU a little bit. I don't have the Ryzen 5 1400, so it will be the Ryzen 5 1500X. And now we don't have a CPU bottleneck anymore. I don't know if the Ryzen 5 1400 will still be a bottleneck, because the 1500X still give us a CPU average of high 50s to low 60s. But now we up our average FPS also to 36 with FSR quality. I guess we found our AMD CPU. Now we just need to find out which GPU. Next up I have the RX 560 4GB variant, a bit younger but a less performing card than the R9 380. And it shows, because at 1080p at the lowest settings with FSR balance, we get an average of 24 FPS. This is unplayable. When you're in encampment village or fighting a boss or a lot of minions at the same time, your FPS drop in the high teens. This is a no-go. But I'm not done. I have older AMD card with 3GB of VRAM, and that will be the HD 7970. And I don't know why, I think I was expecting similar result with the GTX 670, which is old but gave quite a decent performance. The HD 7970 does not. 1080p with the lowest setting possible, FSR balance, dynamic resolution at off, we still get an average of 24 FPS, and it's up and down. Just fighting 3 minions, you're going to drop in the low 20s FPS. No minion at all, you're going to have a 49 FPS. Reaching an encampment or the village, you're going to drop in the low 20s again. And that's all my collection of AMD card that have 3GB of VRAM or more. my collection is not that big on AMD side, so that's what I was able to test with. So that's all I was able to test for Path of Exile 2 real minimum requirement. And the winner for the real minimum requirement on the GPU side is the A310, as long as you have a system that supports resizable bar, the GTX 670 4GB variant, the R9 380 4GB variant. On CPU side, we have the i7 5920K and the Ryzen 5 1500X, and obviously 8GB of RAM. Thank you to have come watching, see you on the next one, and subscribe.